My next guest this afternoon is the Shadow Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Government Services too. Bill Shorten, welcome.
G'day, how are you, Patricia?
I'm good. The Chief Medical Officer advised the federal government that Australia's ban on arrivals from India could result in people becoming stranded or dying in the worst case scenario, but equally it did also say that we needed to deal with this because of a potential third wave. The federal government immediately obviously took this action and says that it was transparent with the public. What do you think should happen now?
Well, I think in all cases we should follow the medical advice and obviously by closing commercial flights between Australia and India, that's the right thing. But Patricia, I just want to make clear for the record that I think that stranding our Aussies overseas, and I've said this before in other countries, but stranding Aussies in India with no means to bring them home, with no separate quarantine, which they could pay for, I think history is going to judge this period of government very poorly. I think it is cowardly. You think it's cowardly? And
yeah, I do. OK, so if you were in charge, I mean, you ran for Prime Minister,
yeah.
it didn't work out that way, but what would you do right now?
Well, 16 months ago, I'd have started building federal quarantine facilities outside the major cities. I mean, the Constitution gives quarantine power to the feds. I mean, this is not a new idea. Go back 100 years and down at Point Nepean and south on the Mornington Peninsula were quarantine facilities. Our founding drafters of the Constitution put quarantine in because coping with diseases from overseas was an issue. But, I mean, the government's had 16 months and all they ever do is blame the states. It's really weak.
So you say that it's weak. The government says, well, when it first started, they did the same with China. Is it the same?
Oh, well, what do you think?
Well, I'm asking you.
Well, OK, well, it's the facts. How many people have come to Australia from countries with COVID? UK, United Kingdom, and for quite a lot of the time, China. I've got no hassle with closing the borders. I support that too. And in fact, I was saying they should do more action when Scott Morrison was still wanting to go and cheer his Sharkies on at the NRL. But the point about it is that Australians are stranded overseas. And I'm not here to judge the motives of why they're overseas. And of course, you can't just bring them back into the general community. But being an Australian citizen and in danger, don't we have an obligation? I mean, I remember a couple of decades ago when a yachtsman, his yacht overturned in the Southern Ocean. We sent a whole warship to get one guy. He wasn't even an Aussie. But, you know, you've got Australians stranded and this government puts everything in the too hard basket. It's just hopeless and weak. And I think that whilst at the moment the Morrison's rhetoric may gain some favourability, in the test of time, I think this will not be viewed as Australia's finest moment.
And what sort of impact is it having on the Indian-Australian community?
I think most of the Indian-Australian community, certainly all the ones who've contacted me, and I'll just speak for that, they get the closing of the borders, but I think they are shocked. I mean, I got a dreadful, heartbreaking email from a person who's, you know, had to go over and see their father because they were dying. There were no restrictions saying you couldn't go. And but they've got a family here who are doing a tough look. I know during COVID a lot of us were separated from loved ones, but when you've got people in peril, just washing your hands of them like Pontius Pilate, I don't know, it doesn't feel right.
Look, I asked Jane Hume about this in my interview with her. She said it was all based on the Biosecurity Act that Labor voted for too.
Sure.
OK, so Labor voted for a piece of legislation which allows for this to happen. It begs the question, should the legislation be changed?
Well, no, first of all, it may beg that question for you, but for me, the legislation's there, but why has the government chosen to put it up in lights now? This guy's like the David Copperfield of politics. You know, the old magician, when he's pulling a trick in one spot, the magician's magic is to get you to look somewhere else. I mean, the reality is we've got a really hopeless vaccine rollout in this country, missed all the deadlines, and what they want to do is start looking like they're tough on an issue. Like, can we just talk straight? I get that we don't want to have people coming from COVID countries wandering around our cities. I really get that. I support that. I support the natural anxiety of Australians on that. But we have a bunch of Australian citizens, and this government just has put them in the too hard basket, and I think that's morally reprehensible.
Welcome back to the show. Well, blood on your hands, PM. If our government cared for the safety of Aussies, they would allow us to get home. Those were the strong words from cricketing great Michael Slater, who, along with a group of IPL players and 9,000 other Australians, remain trapped in India as the COVID situation worsens. For more, we're joined by Shadow Minister for Government Services, Bill Shorten, and from 9 News in Melbourne, Brett McLeod. Good morning, guys. Nice to see you. Bill, a brutal takedown from Michael Slater. What do you think?
Michael Slater's just saying what a lot of people are thinking. I mean, we all get why the borders have to close. We discussed this last Tuesday on this segment. But I also said they should work out how to repatriate Australian citizens to Australia and keep them in quarantine. I just want to say to the punters out there who think that the people overseas should just be left to be stranded, it's not right. I think that Mr Morrison should have created special quarantine facilities here. He's had 16 months, so Michael Slater's just telling the truth.
There is a provocative headline in today's Age, Brett. It says, if there were 10,000 Australians with white skin, would they have done the same thing? Do you think there's anything to that, or is that a bit harsh?
It may be a bit harsh in the sense that there are Australians with white skin who are stranded in India too. I don't see it as necessarily being racist. I know some people have said that, but it is discriminatory. I mean, I was in Lebanon in 2006 when Australia organised a special boat to get people out of Beirut to Cyprus. And I've always thought that is the Australian way. That's what Australian governments do, is when Australians are in crisis, they get them out. But not only to shut the door, yes, many of other countries have banned flights from India, the US and the UK included, but to make it a criminal activity, to threaten people with jail just to come home is not in any way right, I think. And I think I would not be surprised the government changes its policy very soon.
And look, this pandemic is truly awful in India. The numbers are beyond anything that we've ever seen. So we get the whole idea and the whole notion of trying to prevent them or at least limit them. But the idea of that fine or jail terms and times is awful for any Australian. It's incredibly heartless. The problem is our hotel quarantine system can't cope with a big influx from India, Bill.
Well, again, it goes back to what Mr Morrison been doing for the last 16 months. I mean, people don't want to hear about politics this early in the morning on breakfast TV, but you've got to ask yourself as you're packing the kids' lunch today, why didn't ScoMo build facilities away from the big cities so we could cope? I mean, this is at the heart of the matter. I think it is disgusting that Australian citizens can't come home to secure facilities. I think it is a complete failure of leadership.
Bill Shorten is the Shadow Minister for Government Services and the NDIS. Has been good enough to join us. Morning to you.
Good morning, Pricey.
The PM's clearly rattled. He's jumped on both Sunrise and the Today Show today. Michael Slater, of course, on Twitter last night suggested that he might have had blood on his hands. I think that's probably a bit over the top, but they have very much confused Australians about where they stand on getting Aussies back from India, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. And just let me say at the outset, for a lot of listeners you have on your show who might be saying, oh, it's not racist. I get it's not racist to want to make sure you don't have a COVID outbreak in this country. So I'm not taking the debate in that direction. But by the same token, we've had 16 months to set up quarantine facilities outside of our big cities. And I do not for the life of me understand why the government sat on its hands for that period of time.
It beggars belief. I mean, Scott Morrison's in Darwin last week saying he's going to expand Howard Springs by 2,000. I mean, clearly it was obvious from February last year when we shut the borders to China, Bill, that we would need to up our quarantine protection in this country. I mean, why has Christmas Island not got people on it?
I have no idea. I mean, obviously, Scott and I have had our disagreements from the last election, but I'm capable of parking that. But it's this sense of the government, the Prime Minister, if only he knew someone who knew the Prime Minister to do something. I mean, he is the man who's in charge. If you go down on our Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, down at Point Nepean and almost at the very tip, there were quarantine facilities built in the 19th century where people would come on the ship, the flag had come up if they had fever on the ship, and the people would be put in quarantine away from the city. So we've known about, in the Constitution, which, the Constitution doesn't talk about air flight or a whole lot of things which hadn't been invented, but it does talk about quarantine. It's a specific power of government. So it's just, I feel for every Australian citizen and their family, especially the ones trapped overseas, they could be brought back. They could pay, even if they've got to help pay for their own quarantine, I'm sure a lot of them would. But we should be, there's a basic principle here, mate. We've got to look after Aussies when they're in trouble.
Well, you've been in government and in opposition for a very long time. We've done it before. I mean, I don't need to remind you what we did when the tsunami hit Southeast Asia and we went into places like Phuket and brought Australians back. We went to Java. We filled planes up, went to Bali and brought people back after the terror attack.
Exactly. That was all before my time. But John Howard wouldn't have said, oh, well, no, not my, no, or blame the states. Why haven't the states got people back? I mean, in Lebanon, there was a big civil war, or at least certainly a lot of military unrest. We just hired a ship and took them from the port of Lebanon to Cyprus. And what's happened to that sort of thinking? I've said several times in several media outlets over several months that quarantine's a federal responsibility. Sure, the states have taken up some of that role, but when you've got people trapped overseas, well, to me, it's a no-brainer. Bring them back safely. Don't have them wandering around the general population. But to do nothing, to me, is cowardly, and I think history will not judge this moment very well.
The government is today slightly changing what I believe they did on Friday night. They said on Friday night in an alteration to that act that if you came back to Australia from India, you face jail and a hefty fine. I mean, you and I both know no one will go to jail, and the fine probably never be fined. No one will be fined at all. But they're now saying that if you go to a third country and spend 2 weeks in quarantine, you will be allowed to come back to Australia. Do you think that was clear on Friday night?
No, that wasn't. What they did on Friday night is they thought that people were circumventing the ban on coming to Australia by going to a third country. That's why they did this, because they somehow were saying that Australians who gave up waiting for their government to help them, who got on a plane, went to Dubai, or got an Emirates plane back to Australia, they were saying these people should be put in jail. Now today they're saying that's fine. I know, and you're well connected on both sides of politics, Steve. I know there'll be government backbenchers who agree with pretty much everything I'm saying. And
well, Matt Canavan agrees completely with you.
Yeah, well,
I don't know if you want to be in the same room as Matt Canavan, but,
oh no, that's fine.
But he agrees with you. But we checked, Bill, this morning. We went on to the New Delhi Flight Departure Board, and you can get a flight out of India, but you can't go to the UAE because what the UAE's done is banned anyone but UAE citizens from flying back into their own country, which is exactly what we should be doing. So, yes, you can get a flight. You can go to Chicago. Would you really want to go to Chicago and spend 2 weeks there? COVID's not much better in the United States. You can go to Kathmandu, but there's no direct flights back to Australia. It's just ridiculous.
I don't always go overseas, but the idea of having a couple of weeks... Oh, anyway, that's a separate topic.
No, you don't want to go to Kathmandu at this time.
No, I don't want to do it this time. But the reality is that the government's sending mixed messages. They could have built purpose-built facilities in the last 16 months with medical treatment available nearby, and they haven't. And now they've got this vaguely stunned Mayor of Hiroshima look. What just happened? This is above politics, and by that I mean it's not a left-wing way to handle this or a right-wing way. There's just a common sense way, and we're just not seeing it. And sure, I know a lot of people have got their differences with perhaps some of the policies I took to the last election, but on this one, I know what I would have done, and it would have just been to step up.
On the